Hi, I'm Monil Desai.
And I'm Danielle Dory,
I'm Anji Franklin.
And I'm Joanna Kozmaoglu.
and we'll be presenting physician-assisted suicide in the United States. Throughout the presentation, you'll hear us referring to physician-assisted suicide as PAS. So what is physician-assisted suicide? It's a practice in which a physician provides a competent terminally ill patient with a prescription for a lethal dose of medication upon the patient's request to end the patient's life. Is physician-assisted suicide the same as euthanasia? While both PAS and euthanasia involve the use of medications to end a patient's life, there is a key difference between the two, and that's who performs the act to administer the life-ending medication. In PAS, the patient must self-administer the medications. In euthanasia, there's a third party that administers the medication or acts directly to end the patient's life. Euthanasia is illegal in every state. Other practices that should be distinguished from PAS include withholding or withdrawing life-sustaining treatments, pain medications that may hasten death, and palliative sedation. These are all ethically, medically, and legally accepted here in the US. Next slide, please. The next two slides will go over the history of PAS within the United States. For time's sake, I'm not going to go over the slides with you guys, but please feel free to pause the presentation and read it over yourselves. Next slide. Next, let's go over the general statutes and eligibility criteria. It is up to the eligible patients and their doctors to implement these laws on an individual basis. There are no government programs that will provide assistance. However, the Department of Health in each state monitors the laws. Compliance protects the patient's family, and the physician from criminal prosecution. Participation in these laws are voluntary, and no one is obligated to use them. The eligibility criteria that patients must qualify to obtain prescriptions include being a resident of California, Colorado, the District of Columbia, Hawaii starting next year, Oregon, Vermont, and Washington State. You must be 18 years of age or older. You must be mentally competent, and you must be diagnosed with a terminal illness that will lead to death within 6 months. Next slide, please. Next, we'll go over the process of obtaining the life-ending medication under PAS laws. First is the oral request that a patient must make to the physician under PAS laws at any time after being diagnosed with a terminal illness. Typically, this is performed when the patient is discussing end-of-life options with their physician. Next is the first waiting period. This is performed after the first oral request, and once it's authorized, the patient must wait a minimum of 15 days to make their second request. In Hawaii, the waiting period is 20 days. Following this is the second oral request. The patient must make a second request at any time after the 15-day waiting period. Following this is a written request that can be done at any time after the first oral request and is done by using a special form that's provided to the patient. The second waiting period is done after the second oral request, and it's done in the District of Columbia, Hawaii, Oregon, Vermont, and Washington. The physicians must wait 48 hours after the time of receiving the written request, and California and Colorado are not included in this. Finally, after all the above steps are completed, the physician will write the prescription. The patients can fill the script at any time or not at all. The most commonly prescribed medication is a large dose of a sleeping medication, usually a barbiturate. It's prescribed in a powdered form, and the patient mixes it in 4 ounces of water, and they should ingest it within 2 minutes. After ingesting, the patients will usually fall into a sleep within 10 minutes and die within 1 to 3 hours free of any pain. Next slide, please.
As previously mentioned, a few of the jurisdictions in the U.S. where PAS is legal include California, Colorado, Washington, D.C., Hawaii, Montana, Oregon, and Washington State. In Oregon, there has been a steady increase in both prescription recipients and the number of deaths. As of January 2018, prescriptions have been written for about 1,900 people, and 1,200 of those patients have died from ingesting the drugs that were legally prescribed to them. So a relatively recent poll revealed that about 68% of Americans support assisted suicide. However, only a minority of people that inquire about suicide assistance actually follow through with the process. And interestingly enough, data from Oregon and Washington State has also shown that the majority of persons that request PAS are white educated men, a population that is not considered to be particularly vulnerable. We will get into why this may be the case in the next slide. Although 68% of Americans are recorded as supporting PAS, the approval rate differs by factors such as race and ethnicity and religion. But for the sake of time, I'll just focus on race and ethnicity. 53% of white respondents approve of PAS laws, 32% of Hispanics approve of PAS laws, and 29% of Black respondents approve of PAS laws. The reasons that contribute to why PAS approval rates differ by race and ethnicity can also probably explain why the majority of Americans that follow through with the process are white educated men. As we've seen in this class, generally speaking, racial minorities have had a pretty ghastly relationship with the healthcare system throughout the years. So there is definitely a fear of being viewed as throwaway people and a fear of being taken advantage of, which all contributes to the skepticism toward assisted suicide. Next slide, please. From a global perspective, it appears that more Western countries such as Switzerland, Germany, the Netherlands, Canada, and Belgium have legalized PAS, while lower and middle income countries and Eastern cultures have not embraced it. In the majority of the aforementioned countries where PAS is legal, it is necessary that patients are experiencing unbearable suffering in order for the procedure to be performed. I think ethics really comes into play here because how can one measure the suffering of another, especially because people may feel or perceive suffering differently? However, each country does require that the patient is competent, well-informed, and able to make a voluntary request in order to follow through with the procedure, which definitely is important for understanding the gravity of this decision. It will be interesting to see how Eastern cultures address PAS in the future, especially in countries like Japan, where there is a high suicide rate. Next slide, please.
And to give an idea about how this issue has been addressed in our political climate recently, I wanted to mention some main political figures who are in favor of and against PAS. So Judge Richard Posner, who was a circuit judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals, argued that the government should not interfere with a person's decision to take his or her own life, especially in cases where the patient is terminally ill. And this opinion faced sharp criticism by current Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch, who said that he was in stark opposition to this intentional killing, as he quoted it. He wrote a book called The Future of Assisted Suicide and Euthanasia, where he states his opposition to death with dignity or aid in dying legislation. And he concludes by envisioning a legal system which would allow terminally ill patients to refuse treatments that would extend their lives and avoid intentional killing. The patient's perspective and her spouse's support that received a lot of public attention in 2014 with the Right to Die movement was with the diagnosis of Brittany Maynard's terminal cancer and her decision to utilize Oregon's Death with Dignity law. Her and her spouse, Dan Diaz, moved from California because at the time California hadn't legalized these laws. And they moved to Oregon to be able to use this prescription for PAS. And she quotes, "I can't even tell you the amount of relief it provides to me to know that I don't have to die the way it's been described to me that my brain tumor would take me on its own." And after her passing, her husband went on social media and responded to the appointment of Supreme Court Justice Gorsuch and said essentially that if he had met Brittany and witnessed her brutal symptoms, his opinions on the matter of medical aid in dying would be significantly different. The option of a death with dignity program, he says, does not result in more people dying. It results in fewer people suffering. And I'm going to briefly go over a case study that crucially reported some of the motivational factors that patients reported for choosing to go through with PAS. These participants were recruited from advocacy organizations that counsel patients interested in PAS. A total of 159 interviews made up of consisting of participants, patients, and family members were conducted between 1997 and 2001. And they used the term hasten death in order to represent a more neutral term other than PAS to distinguish between aid in dying for people with terminal illness and suicide by those with mental illness. The report concluded by emphasizing the three main issues that led to patients' consideration of PAS: their effects of their illness, like physical changes, symptoms, functional losses; the patient's sense of self, loss of sense of self, desire for control, and fears about the future. And this essentially concluded that recommendations need to be made for providers to invest in high quality palliative care and to repeatedly assess the patient's concerns about their losses and their changing personal experiences with end of life treatment.
I'm going to briefly discuss physicians' perspective on PAS. Both the ancient oath of Hippocrates and the American Medical Association believe that PAS is unethical since physicians follow the principle of first, do no harm, while PAS expects them to essentially snuff out a life. Other issues that have been raised are that PAS currently has no predefined standard of care, there is minimal informed consent in the process, and little direct monitoring. The Oregon law, in fact, guarantees no investigation of deaths under PAS. It is also believed that PAS is discriminatory since it values some lives less than others and is unnecessary because of improvements in palliative care. Additionally, some believe that PAS is about saving money for the healthcare system and has little to do with autonomy of the patient. Next slide, please. On the opposite side, certain physicians argue that PAS gives a chance to patients to say a proper goodbye to their loved ones and helps them overcome anxiety and fear that accompany a chronic, incurable disease. It also reduces needless suffering of patients and their families. PAS protects the rational choice of ending life, but mental illness and depression must be guarded against in this context. Some physicians support PAS if at least two physicians have agreed to the patient's decision and believe that physicians must put themselves in patients' shoes to truly understand the situation, while at the same time preventing and countering any undue influence. Next slide, please. So how do we address PAS? We must debate legal protections such as living will, predefined patient-specific triggers for PAS, mandatory psychiatric evaluations, standardization of procedure, and ensure adequate supply of drugs such as secobarbital so that PAS, if permitted, is truly painless. We must also encourage patient education along with family members, increase awareness in the general population, as well as educate our healthcare workers. Potentially, a HIPAA-compliant video monitoring of each case of PAS may be considered to allow judicial overview in case of abuse, negligence, or undue influence. Next slide, please. It is definitely a controversial issue with strong arguments on both sides. From an ethical standpoint, we must consider the issue of patient autonomy versus sanctioned murder, cultural and religious stigma against suicide, and prevention of undue influence. It is important to note in every case that who is making the actual decision to end life, and is there a financial motive behind it? Who stands to gain? Family, insurance company, or the government? We therefore need increased education, awareness, and debates that result in a clear and ethical guideline to protect all stakeholders. Next slide, please. Thank you, everyone, and here are our sources.